Well, if you do have a Bible in front of you, do please turn it to Ephesians and chapter 6. I want us in particular to sort of centre our thoughts around verses 10 to 18, the passage I read earlier. But also, if we have time, I want to sort of also bring in Matthew chapter 25 as well. If I spend too long in Ephesians 6, I will just not go to Matthew 25 on the slides there. Sometimes that happens when we're preparing a sermon and you find we have a third verse, in which case that is the sermon, and the Lord has led in that particular way. People know you've got, no, I'm not going to go there, right, okay. I don't know about you, but I get seduced. I get seduced by these buy one, get one free offers. I'm sure I'm the only one. It wasn't long ago that Judy opened up the cupboard under the sink in Gibraltar and turned around and said to me, "Why have you got 2.5 packs of dishwasher tablets? You do most of your washing up by hand." I said, "Well, I'm getting towards the end of one, so I went to get another." So I was, well, and they had two for one. So she said, "Yeah, and the 3 bottles of fairy liquid." And as you guessed it, Morrison's do them for £1. Like 3 times a year, I've now cottoned on to their repeat promotion. So when they do that, go and think of all the money you save when you take advantage of all these promotions. 3 for 2 doesn't sound bad, but 2 for 1, that just, that really does sound like they're almost giving it away, doesn't it? And why do I mention that? Well, it is obviously relevant. It's not just someone I was talking to who'd actually come back to Gibraltar from living away, and so he was re-encountering British supermarkets in the fall. We have Morrison's in the fall, by the way, as well as Spanish supermarkets, so you do still get that. And he said one of the biggest differences he noticed in the UK and Gibraltar compared to where he'd been was this selling by supermarkets of goods and offers. He said for him, he almost thought he was just being bombarded with these sorts of things. And surprise, surprise, he too was succumbing to these offers. And when we do it, we may tot up how much we think we save. I try now to think, did I really come in to buy that? Because if not, it's actually a case of how much I've spent rather than how much I've saved. But on a serious note, if we save money, what do we do with it? I don't see that my shopping bill is really any lower as a result. And as we consider sacrifices made, and I appreciate the illustration is a somewhat poor one, and this Sunday in particular, we think of those who've given their lives in armed conflicts, and we often hear the phrase, don't we, at the end of the war, there's going to be a fantastic peace dividend. And that got me thinking this morning. As we think back to the armed conflicts, primarily of the last 100 years, and in particular what is also known as the Great War, then what have we done with the peace? What is the peace dividend? And how has that been spent? Because it's all too easy for us to trot out words like that. But how do we translate that in practice? And how do we apply that in our own lives as well? And this year is more poignant because it is an anniversary. And as I was saying earlier, really, it really came back afresh to me as I was preparing for today. I hadn't realised how influential the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 was in shaping Europe as we have it today. Now, I've just done a quick calculation in my head, and while some are close, I think I'm confident in saying no one here was actually alive when that peace conference in Paris took place. But it defined the European boundaries. It made changes, and some of those boundaries have been fought over since. Some were then restored through the Second World War. And I'm not going to dwell on sort of the current negotiations on Brexit, but it does seem to me that it's a particularly poignant month, as I said earlier, because we have so many things that come together, and it's just my prayer in that we, those who make decisions, will remember the lessons of history, if I can put it that way, in all the dealings that we have. And if you read about these armed conflicts, if World War One, as it were, the Great War defined Europe as we see it, then commentators talk about World War Two as the war that perhaps had a huge impact on the culture of society as we know it today, that took our own nation economically to the brink. And I have already mentioned that I think one of the things that strikes me most about Gibraltar, and people are welcome to visit. I've had several visitors already. Some are coming over the next 12 months as well. I think if you've never been to Gibraltar, it is definitely worth a visit. Not simply for the rock, not for the monkeys, but they are there. But just the whole environment of Gibraltar is fascinating. It's certainly, if you can afford to have a weekend break somewhere to come to, and there is a constant reminder of armed conflicts there because of the history there. And statisticians tell us more people died in the last century as a result of armed conflicts than over the period of records up to that. So it is a stark reminder for us. But this isn't a sermon about World War One, or a sermon about World War Two, or even about armed conflicts per se. And that's why I chose the passage that we read earlier, because to my mind, as we think about the process of armed conflict, and if we think about wars, then that takes me back to that greatest war of all, and that is the war with sin, and that is the war that and the victory that has been obtained for us through Jesus Christ on the cross at Calvary. But that doesn't mean that our foe, who is ultimately defeated, is yet fully vanquished. And that's why Paul in Ephesians chapter 6 is so determined, as he writes to this church in Ephesus, as he's laid out for them in the previous chapters, very practical advice. He's shared with them his love. He's talked about unity in the fellowship, and he's done that in the first couple of chapters of the book. He's prayed for them. Unity and instructions for general living come in chapter 4. He moves into chapter 5, and he starts to paint this picture of where, as Christians, individuals have come from. And then, as he comes into chapter 6, whilst he's still talking about the family, as he's done for the previous 3 chapters, the family there in Ephesus, and practical instructions for living, it's almost as if in each of these chapters he matches up those practical instructions on the one hand with some very discerning advice on the other. He does that for us in chapter 6 here, and in particular from verse 10, when he talks about us putting on this armour of Christ, because we are in a battle. And if we have to put the first slide up, I'll put them putting it. No, not that. Yeah, right. Yeah, I think let's put all the points up. But yeah, as I've said, the battle continues, but the war has been won. And that's a really important point for us as Christian believers, because Jesus having won the battle does not mean that our life thereafter is necessarily going to be easy in all respects. There are difficulties, there are trials, there are challenges, there are disappointments, and yet it's important in terms of the context that we maintain, and as Paul reminds the church in Ephesus here, that the battle is won. But what that doesn't mean is that it's going to be an easy life, because he says in verse 12 that having put on this armour, you need to do that, because our struggle isn't against flesh and blood, against rulers, against authorities, but effectively it's against the powers of darkness in this world, against spiritual forces of evil in heavenly realms. In other words, he's saying that as we live out our lives here, whilst we take on the resources of God, nevertheless the environment in which we live, the world in which we live, those with whom we have contact, the pressures around us, it's not always easy to separate. They're almost so intertwined, and circumstances and situations that befall us individually are the same. Life becomes so difficult, because it's not a human fight, it's not a human battle, it's a spiritual. And I wonder whether we make the mistake of sometimes believing it is a human battle, not a spiritual. And what I mean by that is that we think, oh, I just need to be a bit better. I just need to be a bit quicker at doing that. I just need to be a bit stronger at doing that in my own strength. Yeah. Yes, it's right that as we seek to be more Christ-like in our lives, that we use the gifts he's given. We do need to remember things. We're in a spiritual battle, and therefore there is a dimension to that. But if we simply seek almost to rely on our own strength, then we know what the answer is. We know what the answer is. We're going to get overwhelmed. We're going to face pressures which, if we try and approach them on our own, are too strong. Equally, there will be circumstances that if we try to understand what's happened and why it's happened and how that was allowed to happen, and we try to logically understand that in a human way, we never will, because there is a spiritual dimension to the battle. Now, if you go back to various military conflicts, I wasn't going to refer to any particular example, but often there comes this point in a particular war where one side gains the ascendancy and the outcome is known. But most of the time, you don't find that the other side at that point in time just lays down its arms and surrenders. Often what happens is they go on a trail of destruction. They don't observe the niceties of war, if you could call them niceties. And they become even more dangerous and more damaging, and the nature of the conflict leads into atrocities that are even worse. And my friends, we have that in a spiritual context as well. The closer we walk with the Lord individually and collectively as a fellowship, the more we enter that spiritual battle, the more we will be changed. That's a fact that we need to recognise, and that's why Paul is so keen here, as he pulls this letter to the Ephesians to a close, to talk about equipping oneself for the battle. As he thought about the advice he could give this young church in Ephesus, he placed the emphasis on the tools that they had available to use, the need to take those tools on board. we have the unlimited resources of God at our disposal, do we call? I remember the number of times I've had a quick job to do in the house, and I've probably got the right tool, but it's in the garage, it's up on the third shelf here. And now I am trying to do something with inadequate tools. And often in the end I make a complete botch of it. Or I end up having to go back and get the right tools to do the job in the right way. It's a poor illustration, I know, but I think you know what I'm driving at. That are we stepping out ourselves, or have we got that Bosch super multi-powered, all singing, all dancing tool that will help us succeed? Paul isn't saying here in verse 11, put on some of the armour of God. You notice that? He said, put on the full armour of God. Now, that does conjure up in my head a picture of someone weighed down with a load of heavy armour. But he's only saying it because it's important. We need to have the strength, and we need to avail ourselves so that we can, why? So that we can take our stand, as he says in verse 11, against the devil's schemes. And I do love the way he then builds that theme through into verse 13, where he said, and having taken him on and stood, you will continue to be able to stand after you've done everything. So that's why it's important that we recognise that whilst the battle against sin has been won, so the battle continues because the war has been won, and it's a spiritual fight, not just a human one. And there's the challenge here from him that we use the right tools, and that we employ those tools appropriately. We've got the tools. Do we apply them appropriately? It's interesting challenges. How do we do that? Are we seeking to go out in the Lord's strength alone? Are there times when we need to be more in tune with each other as a fellowship? So the strength comes not individually with the Lord, but collectively as a fellowship as well. I don't know, sometimes I think we perhaps need to be making more of that. Otherwise there's a subtle danger that again we almost default back to what we can do in our own strength. Someone once said of a sword fight, you can't expect to win a sword fight with a sword you've never used. And I thought, I've never had a sword fight, so I thought, okay, how do I explain this illustration? I think what they meant was this, that it's, the best example I can give, and there's a few people, Paul, Andrew will identify with this. You're not going to hit a 230-yard drive with a new driver until you practice with it. That would be the golfing equivalent for me. Because if you've got a new tool, it's different. It feels different. The weight, the balance will be slightly different. And therefore, you need to sort of harmonise body and tool together to be most effective. And whilst that applies in the physical realm, my friends, it applies in the spiritual realm as well. We need to put the two together. So it isn't just taking tools here that Paul talks about, but it's gaining that familiarity with them. And we do that through fellowship, we do that through study and understanding of the word. And I think part of that is comes through here very clearly in verse 15. So he's talked about the armour, he's talking about standing firm, and then he goes on to talk about what's in our feet. And with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. And in addition to all this, verse 16, take up the shield of faith with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil. So let me come back to where I started this morning. Not the story of the fairy liquid and the dishwasher tablets, but the point that came through that. After war, there's a peace dividend. How are we using the peace dividend that we have, the relationship that we have with the Lord Jesus Christ? How are we appropriating the resources that He, as Lord of all, has given us? How are we prepared as we walk with Him? How are we preparing our hearts and minds for the challenges from Satan? Who is that? As I said, the war is won, but He continues to battle with us. And my prayer this morning is we remember those who have made the ultimate sacrifice for them. We remember that greatest sacrifice of all, the Lord Jesus Christ, giving His life for us. And a challenge to us this morning to walk in the Spirit as we live our Christian lives. And do so to His glory and also for the benefit of others. I was going to loop on to Matthew's Gospel, but I'm not going to do it. I've done this once or twice before. Before I started, I felt I wanted to keep this through for the discussion this morning. My time is gone. So they are pictures. Sometimes you should only do 30 minutes. Otherwise, you should be here till 2:10 and go straight into canvas and circles this evening. But the greatest battle of all has been won, and we praise the Lord for that. As a result of that, we worship at a higher throne. And there is a higher throne, and it's our pleasure to close our service as we sing about